And thanks to all of you for being here. I've been looking forward to this talk for a while now, and it's a real pleasure to welcome both Lawrence Rinder and Christian de Vietri here today. I'm going to briefly tell you about both of them and then hopefully quickly hand over to them because I know you'll be most interested to hear their conversation. Starting with Lawrence Rinder, he's had a really long and active career. I'm just going to tell you some of the highlights. He started out studying art and then art history, and taught at Columbia University and UC Berkeley. He was the Anne and Joel Ehrenkrantz Curator of Contemporary Art at the Whitney Museum, and then moved to the other side of the country where he was the Dean of the California College of Arts in San Francisco. I think he started out teaching there and then became the dean, and then became the director of the Berkeley Art Museum and the Pacific Film Archive. And he's now emeritus from there, which is lucky for us because we get him to do events such as this, which is wonderful. I came to know about him when one of my students sent some of his articles to me, and I was particularly interested in how he spoke about our experience with art. For me, I think his work is so important as it's helping us to understand more about art and to refine our views of art. I think he's made his career of sort of introducing into museums and discourse overlooked art from across cultures and setting things up in conversation and juxtaposition in ways that help us to see new possibilities for how we might define art. I think he also stretches our mind towards new understandings. And this, for me, sort of dovetails a bit with what the school is trying to do. We're looking at art and the knowledge systems that underpin art across cultures, across time, across geographical space to try and understand how it's important for contemporary artists and others today. So I think there's a dovetail there. And that sort of brings me to Christian, who I think is also interested very much in art and the related knowledge systems that underpin art. Christian was an artist from a very young age and also did his BA in Australia, and then postgraduate work in France, in Paris and Marseille, and then an MA at Columbia University, where seems crucial that he was also studying at the same time philosophy of religion, as well as doing his MA in arts at Columbia University. He's a sculptor, a very successful sculptor, widely exhibited with a long list of national museums and prestigious galleries where he's exhibited. He has large public artworks in urban settings in the US and Australia and China. And alongside this, he's been deeply engaged with the traditional knowledge of Indian knowledge systems, with traditional Indian knowledge systems. And he spent a long time with masters of classical yoga and meditation. And as he says, through this, he received direct transmission of teachings and practices and formal initiations into lineages. He also studied Vastu science with Dr. Jesse Marquet. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Is that right, Christian? The Vastu science of artistic creation, and he received authorization to practice and teach. And I feel very fortunate to know Christian. I don't really, it's funny because it's one of those kind of relationships where we've never met in person. I've known him for a couple of years, but we still never met. It's all online, but it somehow it seems to work. He's doing his PhD at the school, and I'm really fortunate to be able to be supervising that. He's also an associate artist at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, and I think although his background, this whole bits of all this background, I think really prepared him for this almost inconceivable task that he took on of instantiating these mandalas that had been lost to us. And when I was watching him do this, I mean, I didn't know him that well, but I came to know that when he was with the whole project, it was done with great thought, but also knowledge of what was involved and a complete respect for the knowledge that he was dealing with. That's what really came through to me. And so with that, I'm really pleased to hand over to Christian and Larry so that they can talk more about this exciting project that Christian's done and which is published in this book.
Great. Thank you, Emily, and great to see you, Christian, and everyone else who's on the Zoom. Thank you for joining us. Christian, your book is amazing. It's astonishingly informative. It's beautiful, and for lack of a better word, I'll use a term that you don't hear much these days, magisterial. I don't know, what do we call magisterial? Gothic cathedrals maybe, but your book, I think, fits. It's an amazing book, and hopefully by the end of this Zoom, people will understand a bit about why I use such a highfalutin term. So I know that some people on the Zoom may not be familiar with the contents with Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism and so on. So I thought it would be good to start with some of the basics. Christian, could you tell us what is Trika and how does it differ from other forms of Tantra? The title of your book is Trika Maṇḍala Prakāśa. And so what is this Trika?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Lawrence. Thank you also. Just before I dive in, I'd like to thank Emily for organizing this event. And of course, you, Lawrence, for graciously accepting the invitation and engaging with the work, and to the school for hosting the event. I'd also like to mention Emily's support during the editing phase of the work was really absolutely invaluable. We had many conversations that led to new insights and refinements. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank Emily for her contribution. So yeah, so getting back to your question, Lawrence, about the Trika. The Trika is a non-dual Shakta Śaiva tradition that flourished in medieval Kashmir. We could think of it like a comprehensive science of consciousness, which offers practical technologies, inner technologies, methods for self-realization. I think the core teaching of the Trika perhaps could be encapsulated in a single sutra, an aphorism, which was revealed by the sage Vasugupta, who tells us, Chaitanyam Atma. Chaitanyam Atma. It's essentially just consciousness, self. The self is consciousness. Consciousness is the self. So this is a tradition that emphasizes the primacy of consciousness. And consciousness in this context is understood as the base of reality, the ground from which the material world emerges. And it's important to note that this is, of course, antithetical to the contemporary materialist view of consciousness as arising evolutionarily as an emergent property from matter. All the practices of the Trika are then geared towards leading an aspirant to an abiding recognition of the unbounded eternal consciousness as our shared fundamental identity. In other words, total immersion in and as the true self. Regarding the question about how it differentiates itself from other forms of Tantra, while other forms may focus on attaining another realm, for example, or appeasing an external deity, securing powers, the Trika is really a Tantra whose center of gravity is the immediate non-dual recognition of the divine as oneself. In this system, there are other more laborious means of liberation, which do exist in this tradition and other traditions, like external ritual and physical yoga. in the Trika, they're subordinated to a direct method of realization. It's also significantly different from renunciate spiritual traditions in the sense that it emphasizes liberation whilst living in the world rather than seeking to escape it. And it's radically life-affirming in that sense. Just to get back to the word, the name Trika, I think it's good to mention that simply means triad. And most importantly, perhaps it refers centrally to the three goddesses named Para, and Apara. And then by extension, that triad in a sense fractalizes into multiple triads as like pedagogical lenses for conveying the nature of reality. For example, one triad is the process of cognition, which is divided into knower, knowing, and the known object. Another triad is the process of creation, which is divided into will, knowledge, and action. So I hope that gives some kind of preliminary to to understanding this tradition, and I think we'll sort of unpack more as we go on, Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you. It's complicated on first hearing, and yet I think there's one thing that you said that I think is maybe key, but I'd like you to unpack it a little bit. You said that one of the most important features of Trika is a direct method of realization. Can you talk more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's a sort of highest first teaching, the most for an aspirant desiring liberation, the Trika offers, in a sense, practices and a hierarchy of practices that all would lead to the most direct realization of truth. So when engaging with external ritual and other practices like that, there is, in a sense, an automatic or often unconscious divide that will occur between the subject, the object, the worshipper, and the worshipped. So the practices in the Trika are sort of all moving towards a point where that divide is. Oops, I'm sorry, that's a call coming through. Where that divide is, in a sense, it's collapsed. I'll just put my. See if I can. Sorry, I'm just going to put myself on airplane mode. I'm not sure how to do that. I'll see if that remains silent. So the collapse of the worshipper and the worshipped, and the subject and object, God and self, that's in a sense what non-duality in this context is about, and that's what all the practices at the highest level would lead to. And for example, when also speaking about the triads, like we talked about the will, knowledge, and action, the direct realization that we're talking about, the immediacy of a direct realization is the collapsing of the triad into its sort of center in all those triads. And it's about experience, and there are specific practices that will lead to that experience. And in a sense, one of the terms used by Abhinavagupta and his disciples is a sukhopaya, which is an easeful means. So that is really the emphasis in this tradition.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Abhinavagupta. Tell us more about who he was. I know he is essential to your project with this book. Who was this person?
Yeah, so the Trika is known primarily through the exegetical work of Abhinavagupta. And his magnum opus, the Tantrāloka, is considered the most comprehensive presentation of the system. And we actually know a lot about Abhinavagupta, biographically speaking, because he shares so much about himself in his own writings. So we know he lived in cosmopolitan 10th century Kashmir. He was the son of landholding Brahmins. He had over 40 teachers throughout his life. He was a scholar, an aesthete, a poet, a musician, a polymath. But I think above all, his disciples refer to him as a Siddha guru, an accomplished master. And indeed, 1,000 years later, his words still resonate across time and space with the intense spiritual power of a liberated being. And so his largest, most influential work, the Tantrāloka, literally meaning light on Tantra, it's a monumental explication of tantric doctrine and practice, organized across 37 chapters and running over 5,000 verses. It's an exegetical work in the sense that he synthesizes and reformulates multiple traditions, as well as ordering them into a coherent whole, which he calls the Anuttara Trika, or highest Trika. And of course, it's thanks to the Kashmir series of texts and studies that we have access to this text at all today.
And what was the Kashmir series? I know it was, as you say, very important historically, but it occurred much later in history, 1,000 years later or something like that. What was it, and why did it happen?
Right. Yeah, Abhinavagupta describes Kashmir in his time as a kind of paradise on earth, a place where it was either a poet or a scholar, and even the warriors are eloquent. Historians assume that after the Muslim conquest of Kashmir in the 13th century, the Trika was forced into hiding. It was already a rarefied secret tradition nested within Orthodox Shaivism in Kashmir. But the arrival of Islam initially meant that no other religions were tolerated in Kashmir, and royal patronage of the Śaiva traditions essentially ceased. And over the centuries, a slow process of attrition ensued. There's one study that I think it tells us that by the 19th century, there were only 11 Śaiva families left in Kashmir. But miraculously, these families had preserved through 8 centuries of upheavals the key manuscripts of the tradition. And then at the beginning of the 19th century, there was an Indian king, Pratap Singh, who was reinstated in Kashmir as a ruler for the first time since the 13th century. And recognizing the value of these manuscripts that he knew existed, he gathered, published, and distributed those to prominent universities around the world under the title The Kashmir Series of Texts and Studies. There were about 100 texts published over a couple of decades. And then it seems when these landed in universities, it seems that for several decades, they basically just sat on library shelves gathering dust. But then there was an interest in Indian spirituality, obviously, which began to emerge in the 50s and the 60s. And these texts were then discovered by young university students. So these jewels of wisdom really only just made it through to the 21st century, passing through the eye of the needle. Although the texts are the primary means of by which this tradition has been preserved, the texts by themselves are really not enough to sustain a tradition's vitality. There must also be an oral transmission. And it's important to mention the late great Swami Lakshmanju, widely recognized as the last great Kashmiri guru, who taught and revived these Trika texts orally, and also initiated disciples. So even with the KSTS texts and the oral teachings passed down, certain components of the system remain missing and require revitalization, such as the mandalas, which is the subject of this book.
Right. So can you explain in brief, what is a mandala?
Sure, yeah. The word mandala is multivalent. It can mean a circle. It can mean a disc. It can, by extension, then mean a zone or a region. And I think this breadth of definition is really important, because the mandala as a diagram is like a map of the inner landscape. In a sense, it's like it orients you in relation to a territory that you'll traverse as a spiritual practitioner. It's also a way of organizing space so that the sacred is brought to the surface of awareness, making it, in a sense, it's inhabitable, tangible. Practically speaking, the mandala is a geometric diagram. For ritualistic purposes, it's a geometric diagram drawn on the ground in powder, different colored powders, for ritual purposes, and most significantly for steps of initiation. And so in that sense, it's like a gateway. The mandala, the structure of the mandala is also mapped into the body through visualization as a method of reordering perception. It's this practice, and it differs from one mandala to the next, of course, and according to what tradition you're talking about. But in this tradition, it in a sense, it bakes in an elevated vision of reality into awareness, which ultimately leads to the abiding recognition of the divine within and as one's true self. I kind of like to think of it as the ultimate selfie. It's like a way of knowing through seeing who you truly are.
Yeah, I love the selfie metaphor. You used another metaphor earlier, which I also enjoy. You wrote that the mandala operates like a tuning fork, bringing the body into resonance with the pattern of the whole. I thought that was...
Yeah. So the mandala, there's another level to the mandalas that's worth unpacking, because the mandala is designed, and this relates to the more artistic side of the process, designed on a grid with a very precise orientation. And then, so making it in powder on the ground, it establishes an alignment with that invisible lattice, in a sense, that extends infinitely, which is like Indra's net, in a way, the fabric of the universe. And then when the body comes into contact with that underlying matrix, a sort of harmonizing occurs, whereby the inherent qualities of pure beingness, freedom, bliss, wholeness, are then recognized as one's own. So this is happening below the level of conscious perception, and it's also prior and in a way separate from the ritual activation of the mandala, which is a whole other science in a sense in and of itself. But this idea of placement and locality and alignment with the grid is this, and the relationship that the body then has with that as a form. Yeah, that's the resonance effect that I was referring to there. I'm glad you pointed that out. It's sort of exactly the same thing also happens with temples. It's important to mention in that way because they're also built traditional temples built according to Vastu Shastra are built following that same grid. But the mandala is 2D, whereas the temple is sort of extrapolated upwards, but they follow the same fundamental map for construction in a sense.
Mm-hmm. So let's shift to the project itself. How did your book, Emily showed us before, but I'll show it again, fantastic, great book, Trika Maṇḍala Prakāśa come about? And what were your goals in pulling all this information together and putting it out in the world?
Yeah, when I was first exposed to Trika Śaivism in the presence of an authentic teacher about 13 years ago, my heart just sort of cracked open. It was like an alchemical reaction was set off. The experience actually was profoundly disorienting at first, and it sort of disrupted everything that I thought I knew about life and reality. And I was living in New York at the time, and all the external circumstances of my life, like my work, my apartment, my relationship, it all sort of went up in flames, but it incinerated in this radiant luminosity of something that was growing inside. It was a very, very challenging time, and it was sort of like the source code changed. And it took many years for a new alignment to develop. I'm speaking very sort of personally now. As I then delved deeper, though, into the practice and the study of the Trika, I was just naturally drawn to investigate its visual forms, and I sensed that as an artist, my skills could be valuable to the tradition. So slowly, my artistic work was drawn into its orbit, and to the extent that now I'm directly contributing to the evolution and formation of this path for others. For every tantric tradition, its mandala is really its most important visual form. It's hard to underestimate how significant they are. In a sense, it's like the entire tradition, like all its teachings, its deities, even its history, and its key figures of transmission, they all become condensed into these singular geometric forms. And yet, until now, the full set of the Trika Mandalas, precisely rendered and colored, had not been available. I'd long been very fascinated by the Trika Mandalas and the attempts that had been made to illustrate them. But it really wasn't until I began translating, studying, and drawing chapter 31 of the Tantrāloka myself that I realized just how much was missing in our understanding and application of these forms. So realizing that I had the capacity to see how these mandalas were constructed and that this was an important missing piece of the puzzle for those studying and practicing the tradition, I sort of felt a moral and spiritual obligation to share my discoveries with others. And so that's what I set out to do. I might also just sort of provide another angle to that question. When I had a complete vision of the first mandala. It was sort of like being on a little sailing boat in the ocean, and suddenly like a massive gale of inspiration starts rising within me, and I was really only just prepared for it. Sometimes these things just come out of nowhere, and as the wind picked up, all I could do was kind of hang on for dear life. And simultaneously, I realized I needed to repair and up-level, myself as the vessel in many different ways, whilst sailing to encompass what the current demanded. It was a very demanding process, and it brought me to places within myself that I never knew existed. So from a personal perspective, the goal was really just to ride the tidal wave without falling or drowning, and to surrender to that creative force, and in doing so, then to offer something that would be truly useful for others. So the work was done in that spirit of service.
So if I understand correctly, first of all, the Tantrāloka of Abhinavagupta describes in words some dozens of these mandalas. And I read somewhere that it's speculated that however many they were, I forget the exact number in the Tantrāloka, but that there are probably thousands of others that he didn't talk about within this tradition. But of the ones that are focused on in your book, it's really focused on one primarily, the Trident Lotus Mandala, which I think is chapter 31 in the Tantrāloka, where he talks about it. And as I understand correctly, if I understand correctly, part of the difficulty of sort of bringing this work into fruition in a visual form is that his text is incomplete in some areas or ambiguous, and because there isn't a intervening period of exegetical documents dealing with what this might be, you're kind of on your own in a way, and perhaps this sensation that you experienced, a kind of an upwelling of energy around this mandala, filled in some respect for the lack of specific knowledge about the forms. And I think this is, very compelling and provocative in a way, that you're attempting to reconstruct the visual essence, or a piece of the visual essence of an ancient tradition, in part based on text, but in part based on your own inspiration. So can you talk about that balance and how that functioned both in practical terms in creating this book and as a spiritual journey?
Sure, it's such an amazing question, and it's yeah. I was thinking perhaps, as I should also mention that there have been attempts to create these mandalas, and it's important to acknowledge that before we go on, I think that there have been several scholars who've worked on these in the past. As far as I know, the first published attempt was to draw one of the mandalas was by the Italian Indologist Raniero Agnoli in his Luce delle Sacre Scritture in 1972. And that was really the first translation of the Tantrāloka by a Western scholar, which is really an incredible feat. And then in 1986, there was the scholar Alexis Sanderson published an article called Mandala and an Agamic Identity, with 2 line drawings of 2 mandalas. It's an amazing piece of scholarly work. Later then in 2003, a student of Sanderson's, Judith Torczog, published a study of another mandala in a brilliant article called Icons of Inclusivism, Icons of Inclusivism. But yeah, and in addition to these very erudite examples of scholarly work on the mandalas, there have been also several other derivative designs that have claimed to be Trika mandalas. I argue in most cases these inspired iterations of the forms have done more harm than good in advancing a precise understanding of the designs. You see, the descriptions of the mandalas is very precise. Every word is precise, and really only when followed with a complete accuracy will these descriptions yield the desired results, which is essentially a mandala that can be actually put to use. And so when I say use, I mean it operates in the intended manner, and it's situated within the intended context, and it's also constructed with the intended materials. And all these parameters are really crucial to understanding how and why they're designed as they are. So people can and do invent various different ideas for how sacred forms could be used to, I don't know, sell prints or to make decoration or whatever. But the fact is that they serve a very clearly defined function for spiritual practice. So I have deep respect for Njoli and Sanderson and Torczog, and without going into too much detail, into the technical details, what I propose in the book is that their renderings are incomplete. And then furthermore, as you mentioned, there are 3 other mandalas described by Abhinavagupta that until now have been widely regarded as indecipherable, and they're published here in their full sequence for the first time. So yeah, just getting back to this idea of like Abhinavagupta's selection criteria and how in a way he's curated this chapter, curated the mandalas that he sees as the most significant ones for the tradition. There's an interesting order which doesn't necessarily follow the ritual order, and he's quoting from texts in this chapter. He's quoting from text, and then he's interspersing those quotations with his own commentary and exegesis and explanation. And as you pointed out, the Trika Maṇḍala, well, the trident lotus mandala, which is in a way like the first gateway into Trika practice. It's the initial initiation that one would take. And as far as we know, these mandalas have not been an active component of the system for quite some time. How long? We really don't know. We just don't know how long after Abhinavagupta they continued to be used, or when exactly the last formal initiation with the Trika Maṇḍala took place. Swami Lakshmanju, who I did mention before, initiated disciples, but he did so without mandalas. So while the oral tradition has survived in Kashmir to the present day, there are other significant elements such as the mandalas which have not. Luckily, the mandalas were preserved in the Tantrāloka. But the thing is to understand how the mandalas are made. it's not enough just to read the text, because the descriptions are encoded. So in addition to the basic work of translation, I went through an extended process of decryption in parallel and informed by the artistic work of drawing them out verse by verse. I also consulted experts, notably two tantric practitioners from Kerala, Acharya Krishnan and Acharya Vikas. They were not familiar with these specific mandalas, of course, but the tradition of tantric mandalas is very much alive in Kerala, so they could speak to the underlying principles, and that helped me to fill in some of the gaps in my understanding of particular forms, their coloring, the structure, and so on.
This might be a good time if you have
You want to see an example?
Yes, to see what
Yeah.
all this we're talking about.
Yeah. Let me screen share, and I'll bring up what I think might be. One moment, please. Okay. Okay, so this is one page that sort of came to mind that might be a good one to point to, just to kind of unpack what actually happened here and what's going on. So here you have in the beginning of one of the mandalas, one of the trident mandalas. And you have the drawing. This is essentially what most of the book looks like, is the drawing. And it's a kind of sandwich. There's the drawing, there's the Sanskrit text in Sharada script, not Devanagari, in Sharada script, then the Romanized Sanskrit, and then my translation. So in this example, we have Shula Mula Magatam, Shula Mulagatam, Piti Madhyam, Kabdi Samangulam. So I just zoning in on this one verse. So Shula is trident, Mula is base, Gatam reaching, Piti is the pedestal, Madhyam, that's the center. And then you have Kabdi, ocean, sky, ocean, Sama, the same, and Angulam, the unit. So it's like reaching from the base of the trident to the center of the pedestal is a length equal to the ocean of sky. So you're like, well, how big is the ocean of sky? Well, this is a system that's used throughout the Tantrāloka of essentially, they call it Bhuta Samkhya. It's like a numerical, words that stand for numerical values. So here, well, firstly, you have to sort of situate it also within the sequence to know what the pedestal is, what the trident is, and where those are situated, which is obviously already been drawn in this example. But then Kabdi, what's that? Well, Kabdi is the 10th lunar mansion, which is the sky, and Abdi is well, there are classically 4 oceans, so Abdi is 4. So 4 times 10 is 40. So then you get this measurement here, 40. This is saying this is 40 angula between those two points. I'd like to show this example because it's actually the only place where I've inserted a proposed dimension for the trident base, including the tip and the bulb of the trident. and it's an unusual. It's sort of like the exception in the whole book. It's not included in Abhinavagupta's description, so it's important to mention this. And there are notes at the end of each sequence which describe all these decisions that I've made. But it's not included in the description. But I know from my own practice, and also by looking at other mandalas, the other trident lotus mandala, that's a very necessary component. And even visually, it's like the trident, that's how you draw the trident with the bulb at the end. So it's the only instance where an element has been added that was not explicitly described. I'll show you also, yeah, so in the end, you get, like way down the track, the finished mandala. And I'll also, and then I'll show you the previous one too, which, I could cross-reference the other trident lotus mandala. And so you see these descriptions are quotations from other texts. And for this mandala, for this one here, which is the trident lotus mandala from the Malini Vijayotara Tantra, we do have the original text. For the previous one that I showed, where the bulb was added, we don't have access to that. It's not. It's just one text that hasn't been found amongst many. However, there are multiple different quotations within the Tantrāloka where we can piece together bits of the text here and there. But it's not a given that Abhinavagupta includes the full description as it appears in the original text either. And for example, in this mandala here from the Manali Vijayotara Tantra, you can see when you cross-reference with the original text, the Manali Vijayotara Tantra, which he's quoting, he actually leaves out a verse. It's a very interesting verse because it gives the colors, the full colors, which in my process was integral to completing this particular mandala. So that's sort of a window into the step-by-step process and the kind of like, I don't know, geology of each page in a way.
Yeah. So I hope people are getting a sense of the really extraordinarily detailed and assiduous process that Christian went through to reconstruct these mandalas. And if I understand correctly, Christian, you not only read the Tantrāloka in Sanskrit and translated it, but also consulted the texts that Abhinavagupta referenced in the Tantrāloka to make sure that he was being accurate or quoting completely. And so that's an extraordinary commitment. And one of the things that I love about the book too is, on the one hand, the system that you're describing is extraordinarily canonical and rigorous and set. These things have, very specific measurements. They have specific colors. They have, the whole thing is canonical. And yet there are things that are unknown. There are things that have to be, if not guessed at, we could coin the term felt at, inspired towards. And in the book, one of the things that you do, which I gather Abhinavagupta did as well in his version, is to gloss the canonical expression with notes detailing your, for lack of a better word, struggle to understand and the variations that you considered. So there's this sort of interplay between fixity and openness in the book and in the process, which I find extremely compelling and somehow strangely humble.
Yeah, there are sort of very clear rules to follow, and yet in order to even follow those rules, within that there has to be some like creative maneuvers that take place. And to do this work, I really had to set aside everything that I might have liked the mandalas to be, in order for them to appear as they are. And in that way, it was a very a scientific process. And yeah, like you said, for the most part, the descriptions of the mandalas are complete. They're really complete down to the very last syllable. And at the end of each sequence of configuration, I carefully note where those instances are that I did need to step outside of the text, either to my own experience or to other texts, in order to substantiate one part of the mandala or another. And even within that even in that process, there are accepted protocols that dictate how and when you can draw from other texts. They're like academic but shastric principles. So generally speaking, originality is not originality and invention are not laudable from the perspective of the Indian traditions, in a sense. It's kind of hard for our Western brains to comprehend, because contemporary culture places such a focus on individuality and novelty. But the continuity of these Indic traditions are primarily maintained by passing them on intact from guru to disciple, forming a lineage stream. But there are exceptions, of course, and there has to be exceptions. For example, Abhinavagupta speaks about different kinds of gurus, and he mentions the samsiddhika guru, a spontaneously realized being, consecrated is not by a living guru, but by the divine power of consciousness itself. And this process also of revelation is not entirely like, in a sense, it has precedence in the Tibetan Buddhist tantric tradition. There is also this concept of terma, treasure texts, which are either literally rediscovered in hidden places, like in the pillar of a temple centuries after they were written, or metaphysically recovered from the mind of an enlightened being who brings back a lost teaching back to earth at a particular place at a particular time. So on the one hand, there is this need to maintain the purity of a tradition by acknowledging protocols such as the guru-disciple relationship as the accepted means of transmitting sacred wisdom. But then, on the other hand, there have to be exceptions to account for the fact that sacred knowledge is present and available at all times, and potentially also could be lost at any time. And I think Abhinavagupta himself argues in his text for the liberative potential of the text itself as a form and means of transmission. And he does assert that the liberated consciousness of an author or an artist crystallized in a text or an image can be reanimated and re-experienced by future generations. We might assume that this to be one motivation for compiling the Tantrāloka in the first place. I think it brings us back to that the final line in the Tantrāloka, which inspired your title for this talk, where he ends by saying, "May you invite this wisdom to reside within you." and instantly be goddess graced with its vision of essence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a beautiful last line. I'd love to shift a little bit if we could, Christian, because in addition to being a very accomplished translator and exegesist, if that's a word, and a tantric practitioner also, you are also a practicing contemporary artist. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about your own work and specifically how or if any of these principles are shared or not shared, if there are areas in which your contemporary practice departs drastically from the kind of work you've been doing with the Tantrāloka.
Yeah, my spiritual practice is really the engine behind all my creative work, I think, and my devotion to this tradition has brought me into this kind of intimate relationship with its core mechanics, and now I'm contributing in my own way to its development. And this traditional work serves practitioners directly, and I'm acutely aware of the level of responsibility that entails. In my other work, working, for example, in the public realm, often means working for the state, essentially. And in most countries, there's an unspoken expectation of secularity, of course. It's interesting because I think that despite our attempts to subdue the sacred in daily life, I think every human being actually yearns for an experience of the divine, whether they are aware of it and seeking it or not. And I think since time immemorial, art has provided access to that in one way or another. So one of the questions I do grapple with is with my public work is how can a work of public art embody and transmit universal principles, universal spiritual experience, whilst remaining acultural and unattached to a particular tradition, and also accessible to all. So personally, I've found that the language of minimalism and abstraction useful in that regard. For example, I could mention briefly the artwork I made for Elizabeth Key here in Western Australia, titled Spanda. The Spanda principle is very significant in Trika Śaivism. It describes the primordial impulse of consciousness to manifest as the world. And there's no mandala or deity form that specifically embodies this term, this principle, but I gave it shape in my own way. So personally, in that way, like I also make a distinction between tantric art, which is a tool for practice, and then what I call Tantra-inspired artwork, which may come from the world of the Tantras, but operates more fluidly and aculturally within the world.
So I know that, and you've mentioned this term before, the Śilpa Śāstra, which, as I understand it, is a set of texts that offer kind of canonical terms for architecture and other art forms, perhaps a bit less in a directly spiritual way than the Tantrāloka did, but spiritually grounded, but nevertheless conventional measurements and forms for the arts. Do you use any of the conventions from the Śilpa Śāstra in your contemporary art, and do you think that's a useful or could be a useful tool for yourself or others to make contemporary art?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's something I've sort of contemplated. Obviously, Yeah, obviously that the mandalas follow the rules of Śilpa Śāstra. And although it's not explicitly stated in the text, we can perhaps assume that it was just common knowledge at the time of Abhinavagupta. But certainly my training in that regard was in Śilpa Śāstra was absolutely key to understanding and illustrating these for the book. And as you mentioned, the measurement system in particular is very specific, and it follows really a completely different logic from the imperial and metric systems. Yeah, as for integrating it into a sort of more, I guess, contemporary or gallery-based practice. Yeah, I'm not sure. In a way, like, you know, the work Spanda is hints at this idea of measurement and form. But yeah, it's a good question, Lawrence. I haven't got a great answer for you on that one.
That's okay. So another question related to the relationship between tradition and contemporaneity gets to, you know, my own practice a bit, whereas as I think you know, as a curator, I have on occasion juxtaposed examples of very traditional tantric work, specifically works in the collection of Frank André Jam, which were Rajasthani in tradition, and also some contemporary works, but nevertheless grounded in tradition by Acharya Viyakul, and put these in juxtaposition with modern and contemporary artists such as Agnes Martin and Ad Reinhardt and others. And I'm wondering what you think of that kind of curatorial practice, whether it's do you feel some affinity to it? Do you think it's antithetical to how these things ought to be treated? What's your take on that practice?
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how, like, in many ways, contemporary abstraction has arrived at formal expressions so similar to those of traditional tantric art. And you know, perhaps this supports Jung's theory of archetypal forms that fundamentally shared structures within consciousness that arise across cultures, or, you know, within the collective unconscious, as he puts it. And yeah, I'm not sure if Emily mentioned your contribution to Jamet's book, Tantra Song, which is really significant publication that everyone should check out if they haven't already. And yeah, Jamet, so he speaks about, and I remember him speaking about the ritual dimension of these tantric images that he found, and using them as mirrors, using with mirrors as substrates for external worship. I'm sort of more inclined to think of them as specific pedagogical tools that explain a theory, a specific theory of tantric practice for initiate. But obviously there are many, you know, unknowns in the research on that work, and that's kind of part of their allure. But yeah, I think this idea of tantric art operating within the contemporary context, it's a fascinating question. It kind of reminds me of a conversation that I had a few years back with a prominent gallerist in New York, and we were talking about an icon that I'd made of the sage Matsyendranath, a bronze icon about this big, and he was saying, Christian, I love this work, but there's something missing for me. There has to be some kind of like subversion. There's got to be a twist, something where where you're making your mark, and it's something to make it contemporary. And I was like, no, I think this absence of me is precisely what I'm going for, and it's the kind of I'm not there effect. And I think art of this nature in the book, and also like the tantric images you've dealt with, they're really not about the individual who made them. They're about liberation and release from those limited identities for the creator and for the viewer. So yeah, I know. How do I see these functioning within the contemporary art context? I mean, obviously, there's a place for museum framing and sort of contextualization of this work. I think, if these mandalas were ever brought into that context, though, I'd feel some sense of obligation that to maintain with complete integrity their purpose. Just having had that direct contact and understanding of why, and how important they are. So, there's nothing in the tantric texts themselves that say, this couldn't be done, for example. There are various rules for context compliance related to site selection for initiation. And it may be that a gallery or a museum does fit those criteria. So I guess then it's a question, whether legitimately these could be brought into the contemporary realm. I guess that's a question for gatekeepers of the contemporary art world. But I think just a bit more on that question. I think operating within the gallery system, it generally means complying with the ideology of secular pluralism, which means, for me anyway, not only that many beliefs coexist, but also that no single one is endorsed as true. So immediately, like there's a friction there for sure. And I think, one way around that friction is the kind of like framing of the work as artifact. Also, like, the funny thing is that even though the contemporary art world is supposedly autonomous from these inherited sacred orders, there's a quasi-ritualism and a system of belief for sure. And, galleries themselves are built like sacred spaces. David Zwirner on 19th Street in Chelsea, it's a temple. It's like these white cubes are like 21st century temples. But they don't have windows, and they don't let the light in. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. This idea of how these traditions can be, what kind of relationship they have with contemporary art, the contemporary moment. Yeah.
Speaking of David Zwirner Gallery, the gallery in Paris, at least, I don't remember about the one in New York. One in Paris has skylights, and the last show I went there, a wonderful exhibition of paintings by Susan Fracon, was lit exclusively with natural light. So,
okay.
and it was very temple-like, I will say that. And I also just want to say that I think Agnes Martin and Reinhardt also would probably have agreed with you about the importance of the self-effacement of the artist in the face of something bigger or more fundamental than themselves, even though they weren't necessarily working within the specific tradition of Tantra or any sacred tradition. I think that they both acknowledged some kind of convergence with those traditions. Very, very interesting examples. I wanted to just, before we go, because I think we have a little bit of time for questions, I do want to ask one more thing about your work in relationship to art. At one point, you mentioned that the book itself is a kind of artwork. And I do think that it exists within a lineage of books that have functioned simultaneously as purveyors of information and of artistic sensibility. And I'm thinking specifically of books like Audubon's Birds of America, Owen Jones' Grammar of Ornament, and Ernst Haeckel's The Art Forms of Nature are all books that have, through their incredible, almost unimaginable comprehensiveness, their aesthetic sensitivity, and this kind of sense of overwhelming generosity that one gets when encountering them have a resonance, I think, with your book. And I wonder if how you understand your book as art, and if it makes any sense to put it into context with these other books that I've described.
Yeah, my artistic choices were very much shaped by the limitations of the book as a medium, and that allowed me to consider and play with the unique properties of the book as a medium. For example, there's one section in the book that's like before the decoding of the mandalas, that functions like a flip book, and structurally that can only be done with the medium of the book. And in that sequence, the reader can interactively animate the process of manifestation that explains the origin of the mandala as a form. I also think of the book as the medium, in the sense that it's like the necessary interstitial substance between the text and the active mandalas to be made on the ground. So it's like an artwork designed to empower other artworks, like to replicate itself. That's why the configurations, after the configurations, I've gone to such lengths detailing how, why, when, and where the mandalas would be created. And I know of a few. I know of three now qualified Trika teachers who've begun to use the book in this way. I also just got a very touching letter from the Ishwar ashram, from a member of the ashram, which was established by Swami Lakshmanju. They recently acquired the book. So the mandalas are being woven back into the tradition, even in Kashmir, and it's happening, even faster than I thought. So there's a kind of like active artistic quality, I think, to the book itself, as in that way. But I found it to be such a beautiful. It's such a beautiful medium. I've always loved books. I actually made lots of little books when between the ages of about 5 and 10. I made lots of books on different subjects, and I don't know. I guess I've come back to that.
I'd love to see those someday.
Yeah.
Emily, shall we move to questions from our audience?
Yes, that seems like a very good idea. Rasha, how were you envisioning questions? Are you envisioning people raising their hands or typing questions in the chat? What do you think?
Questions in the chat might be best.
Okay. So thank you both for such an illuminating discussion. I really, questions and answers were really brilliant. And I think that what we saw was a little glimpse into the depth of what's contained in this book, and also the depth of effort that went into it. And beyond that, how art works and how it might work, and what art does and what it might do, the potential of it. And I really enjoyed also the discussion around the contemporary and these images as well. I think that's something for us to continue to think about. So thank you so much, both of you. Yes, Narendra, you say you have 3 questions. Do you want to just open your mic and ask? Is that possible, Rasha?
Yes, one moment. Yes.
Okay, so Narendra, could you open your mic and ask your questions? Maybe while we're sorting that out, we could have this from Alka Tyagi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. It's a very intense and precise exposition of Trika Mandalas and creative process. I am deeply obliged to be a witness of this talk on the vision of essence, and thank you very much. Here's Narendra's first question. What determines the size of the original square in the mandalas? Is there a right of orientation? Do they always face east?
Great question. Yes, in this case, they always face east. The units of measurement, so what was the first was about what determines the initial scale. That's all very specific in the descriptions. For most of the mandalas, for 4 out of the 5 in the book, they're 4 by 4 hasta, which is about they're to be made precisely in that dimension, which is about 3.5 meters. I have a section in the book at the end of each sequence where all the measurements are laid out very precisely. I think, Narendra, you're familiar with the system of measurement. What was the question in between those?
Sorry, I read them all at once.
Can I just quickly unmute? I've figured it out. Sorry, just so I can feel. It was because I'm into yantra, and there's always some aspect, and obviously everything you said just resonated like amazingly. And the east-west axis being, doing the right of orientation before beginning the drawing. And also because yantra these days, and it came into the things you're talking about, the contemporary art scene and all these things, that yantra is always drawn mostly on paper these days, whereas the mandalas are made in powder. So I was also curious as to whether ritualistic or mandala that was used in your tradition is always done with powder, or if a drawn version can be used for practice also.
Yeah, they're not referred to as yantras in the Tantrāloka for some reason. In a sense, the mandala is always the word that's used. And you're right, the mandalas are generally, there's a bit of a blur between those two terms, but mandalas are generally with powder on the ground. And then yantras are generally speaking more for than private practice, and they're on more permanent substrates. So these mandalas, having said that, there are descriptions of how they are then made into yantras, which would be used by a practitioner who's been initiated with the mandala in powder. They would be taught how to take it away and have it on a substrate and practice with that substrate. So mandala and yantra. And like you said, the rites, all the procedures that there's a whole set of procedures that are to occur before making the mandala, to do with site selection, sacralizing the site, choosing the orientation and aligning the grid and so on. So that's detailed in the sort of the last portion of the book, which deals with the various different questions one might have about how this might be implemented.
Thank you. Amazing stuff. I'm going to buy the book.
Here's another question from Vidang Mittal. Is the Trika in the path of Dakshina, or more specifically Vama, in particular focus of the Śaiva Agama?
Deep question. So she's referring to the Dakshina and the Vama currents. And the answer is that, so on the one hand, there is the Vama current, which emphasizes the sort of more erotic side of Tantra. And then there's the Dakshina, which is emphasizes the mortuary side of Tantra. In a way, like Abhinavagupta places the Trika above both of them, and brings together both of them into what he calls the higher Trika. So the answer to that question is that it doesn't sit between one or the other. In Abhinavagupta's formulation, he contextualizes it as beyond those opposites.
Okay, there's another question from Peter K. What other traditions and their mandalas did you explore as part of your preparation?
There's a wonderful book by Gudrun Buneman about mandalas in a more general sense than my very specific exploration here. So that deals with a broader scope of mandalas. Like I said, I also had this contact with the tradition in Kerala and learned quite a bit about, generally, in a very general sense, how those mandalas are applied. There are certain mandalas which are very common and widely known. For example, the Sri Chakra of the Sri Vidya tradition. Like to a certain extent, I was quite aware of the parameters and the lane that I, in a way, wanted to stay in, and what was required to bring these particular mandalas to light. So I delved into parallel traditions momentarily in that way. I hope that answers the question. I'll also say that there's sort of the underlying structure of the mandalas and the creation of the basic form lies primarily in Vastu Shastra as well. So I've, through my training in Vastu Shastra, particularly with building, I was able to also apply that knowledge to the process of bringing these mandalas to life.
Okay, here's a slightly related question from Aparna Srihar, sorry. She says, thank you. Harish Jonerji has also done a lot of work connecting mandalas to consciousness in the last century. How do mandalas from Tantrāloka differ from other mandalas as tools of visualization?
Hard question. I don't know if I can address that. These are very specific, and I think, for every mandala, it plays a very specific role. So there's no sort of generalizing comment that you can make in a way like this. I've provided some general comments about, how they're brought into the body, they're created externally. They're mostly for a sequence of initiations. But I think, with regards to the specific practices that one might do, it's really like very, specific to each tradition. I hope that answers the question. I don't know if it does.
If anyone has follow-up questions to their questions, you can just type them into the chat as well. Okay, the next is from Randa. How does the Trika Mandala compare to mantras and sutras for the realization of the divine? Should there be an initiation for its use?
Initiation, that's an interesting question. Essentially, the mandala is the means through which the mantra and the practice is given. So that's, in a way, the relationship there. And for its use also does, require an initiation and training. So typically, there's two different scenarios. One is that the acharya is taught how to create the mandala. And there's a line in the Tantrāloka where Abhinavagupta describes the transferal of the tools for doing that from the guru to the disciple. The other instance is that an acharya, who's a qualified teacher of a lineage, would engage a shilpan. The shilpan is the artist. So the shilpan is an initiate in Śilpa Śāstra, in Vastu Shastra, and would have the requisite training for creating the mandala, and could do that on behalf of the acharya.
Great. And then there's a thank you for the insight around the Dakshina and Vama in relation to Abhinavagupta. And Patricia Locke says she enjoyed the flipbook section that circled the square in regarding the mandalas as art. And she asks, how can non-practitioners have respectful access?
Respectful access, yeah, okay, that's an interesting question. I think it's just a matter of approaching them with humility and without assumption. These forms, I think one of the things I've been very careful in doing is framing them ontologically as not initiations per se. Like, I'm not providing initiations through the book, but the image functions differently ontologically than the mandala that would be made in the process of initiation on the ground. So I think approaching them is a matter of also just understanding them, making like the sincere attempt to approach it within the context it was intended to operate within. I think that's sort of the fundamental answer to that question, is that they serve specific functions, and whereas we might come to them with ideas of what we want them to be or do, but they have very rich and meaningful reasons for being the way they are.
I think your text at the beginning of the book delves into that quite a lot and is worth sort of reading a few times to kind of get the full understanding of what is at stake here or what's at play here. I think that's. Thank you, Christian. Let's see, a couple more questions. First, I'm particularly intrigued by your interest in Kerala Shaivism, which follows more of an Advaita philosophy compared to Trika in Kashmir. To what extent is Trika documented in Kerala, specifically the Shakteya temples?
Oh yeah, it's very much alive there. The practitioners I had contact with were primarily Sri Vidya practitioners. I actually didn't have much contact with Advaita Vedanta there. And there are many temples, specifically temples to Kali, which are very much related to the Kala Samkarshini in the Tantrāloka. So yeah, I'm yet to kind of delve into that in further detail, but it's very much the Shakta tradition in Kerala is very much alive.
And here's one from Sandra Hill. Could you speak briefly about your PhD research? Are you taking this forward?
I think I'm going to politely decline for answering that question directly. I don't know. I have some odd rules that maybe people don't agree with. I don't tend to speak about creative projects. For me, it's a bit like speaking about trying to talk to a baby that isn't born yet. And I like to sort of keep it in. Yeah. So, but I am continuing on in this vein. I'll say that for sure. Yeah.
I don't think you have any choice, Christian.
No, I don't have a choice. That's correct.
Carla Marchison says, thank you. I felt like a sponge in need to absorb so much to think about. I know this is a random comment, but looking at Christian and Lawrence side by side wearing a white and a blue shirt, it made me think of the symbolism of the white and blue lotus from a class with Renuka. Renuka Gurung is a woman from Nepal, who is a Poba painter who did her PhD research at the school. I don't know, Carla, I don't know what the white and blue symbolism of the lotus with Renuka is. Can you share with us? Or maybe that's too much to ask.
It's a beautiful comment. It's a beautiful comment.
Yeah.
Sometimes the synchronicities happen.
I think, that was ages ago, but I think one was pure spirituality. The other one was wisdom. So the white was the spirituality, the blue was wisdom, or something like that. But it's the first thing that came up to me when I saw the two of you together, wearing the white and the blue.
Thank you.
And then it was borne out in the discussion.
I'll take it.
this is maybe perhaps our final comment. Thank you for today's lecture. It has been very enlightening, and truly thank you both. It's been a real pleasure, and yes, lots to think
Thank
about.
you so much, Lawrence, for your wonderful
Sure.
questions.
Thank you,
Yes.
Christian and Emily, for the invitation. It's been great, just great.
Let's do it again.
Yes. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.